The man on the stretcher is going to die in the next 20 minutes, and every soldier crouched around him already knows it. It is somewhere in the Pacific, in the middle of the Second World War, on an island most of them cannot pronounce, and he has lost so much blood that his lips have gone the color of wet ash. There is no plasma left. The crates ran dry days ago. The supply ship is a rumor somewhere over the horizon, and the nearest hospital that deserves the name is an entire ocean away. So the medic does something that, in any other place on Earth, would look like madness. He walks to the nearest palm, hacks down a green coconut, punctures the top, threads a length of rubber tubing down into the sterile water sealed inside it, and runs that clear liquid straight into the dying man's vein. And the man does not die. You have probably never been told that the fluid inside a coconut is so close to human blood plasma that in an emergency, it can be dripped directly into your body to keep you alive. But that is exactly what happened on more than one island in more than one war. A piece of fruit you associate with sunscreen commercials and paper umbrellas in a cocktail was, within living memory, an improvised transfusion keeping soldiers breathing. Hold that image for a moment, because it is the smallest possible version of the story you are about to hear. A single nut, cracked open on a beach, standing between one nameless man and the end of everything. But this story does not begin on that beach. It begins thousands of years earlier and thousands of miles away, not on land at all, but out on the open sea, with a seed that decided to become a ship. Here's the thing almost no one tells you about the coconut. It is one of the very few things on this planet that can fall off a tree, roll into the ocean, and simply leave. That thick, fibrous husk you have to fight your way through is not there to annoy you. It is a life raft. It is watertight, it is buoyant, it traps a pocket of air, and it can keep the living seed inside it alive and drifting across salt water for 100 days or more. 100 days. That is long enough to cross an ocean. And when that husk finally scrapes up onto a beach 1,000 miles from where it started, the seed inside is not just alive, it is packed with its own private supply of fresh water and food, ready to send down roots into bare sand where nothing else could survive. Think about that for a second. Most seeds are passengers. This one is a vessel, a canteen, and a settler, all sealed inside a single package that fits in your two hands. A thing small enough to carry under one arm quietly colonized the tropical coastlines of the entire world. Which means that long before there were kings, before there were empires, before anyone wrote anything down, the coconut was already conducting one of the largest migrations in the history of life on Earth, and doing it completely alone. Now, here's where it gets strange, because for most of recorded history, the people who eventually ruled the world had absolutely no idea what to make of it. To the ancient Mediterranean, to medieval Europe, the coconut was not a food. It was a mystery, and mysteries in that era were dangerous. Traders brought them up out of the Indian Ocean, and no one in Europe had ever seen the tree. So, the stories filled the gap. They called it the nut of India. They ground the shell into powder and sold it as medicine to cure everything from stomach pain to poisoning. And when the Portuguese sailors finally got a good look at one, at that hard brown shell with 3 little dents in the top, 2 round hollows and 1 below, they did not see a snack. They saw a face, a grinning, hollow-eyed little skull staring back at them. So they named it after a monster. Coco, in Old Portuguese and Spanish, was a grinning goblin, a boogeyman, the ghost that mothers invoked to frighten misbehaving children into bed. The 3 holes looked like the empty eyes and gaping mouth of that creature. So the most useful plant in the tropics, the tree that feeds millions, entered the European languages named after the thing you tell your kids will get them in the dark. Coco, coconut. You have been saying the word for a childhood monster your entire life and never once heard the scream inside it. And that fear was nothing next to what happened with the coconut's monstrous cousin. Because out in the Indian Ocean, fishermen and sailors kept finding something impossible washing up on their beaches. An enormous double nut, shaped unmistakably like the lower half of a human body, dark and polished by the sea, weighing as much as a small child. The largest seed produced by any plant that has ever lived. And no one, for centuries, knew where it came from. No one had ever seen the tree. They only ever found them floating, drifting up dead from the depths. So they decided the tree must grow at the bottom of the sea, on the ocean floor, a submarine forest tended by no one, and they called this thing the coco de mer, the coconut of the sea. And they were terrified of it and desperate for it in equal measure.
Legend insists that a single one of these nuts was believed to be an antidote to every poison known to man. And I will admit the records around those claims are thin, and any honest historian will tell you so. But the fear was real, the price was real, and kings paid it. European monarchs bought them, mounted them in silver and gold, and locked them away in their treasuries next to their crowns. A single one of these nuts could be worth more than a ship full of ordinary cargo. A seed that had simply fallen off a tree and floated was, for a while, one of the most expensive objects on Earth, because men who ruled nations were convinced it could keep them from being murdered at their own dinner tables. The truth turned out to be almost stranger than the legend. The tree was real, it grew on just a couple of islands in the Seychelles, and it grew nowhere else on the entire planet.
And in the 1800s, a very famous, very serious British general named Charles Gordon, the same Gordon who would die at Khartoum, sailed into that valley, looked at those enormous nuts hanging from those ancient palms, and became utterly convinced that he had found the actual Garden of Eden. He decided the coco de mer was the forbidden fruit itself, the fruit of the tree of knowledge that got humanity thrown out of paradise. He wrote it down. He argued it in detail. A decorated general of the British Empire looked at a coconut and concluded it was the fruit that damned the entire human race. That is what this plant did to the minds of powerful men. It didn't just feed them. It haunted them. But while Europe was busy locking coconuts in gold and mistaking them for original sin, half a world away, there were people who had understood the coconut so completely, so intimately, that they had built their entire civilization out of it. You have to understand who these people were, because history has been criminally quiet about them. The Austronesian Navigators, the ancestors of today's Pacific Islanders, were the greatest sailors the world has ever produced, and it is not close. While Europe was still hugging its coastlines, terrified of open water, these people were launching outrigger canoes into the largest ocean on the planet and finding pinpricks of land separated by thousands of miles of empty blue. They settled islands so remote that the next humans wouldn't arrive for 1,000 years. And in the bottom of those canoes, packed carefully for the journey, was the coconut.
They carried it deliberately, planted it on every island they reached, and it gave them, quite literally, everything. Let me tell you what everything means, because this is the part that should stop you cold. From one tree, they drank the water. They ate the flesh. They pressed the oil to cook with and to burn in lamps and to rub into their skin against the salt and the sun. They fermented the sap into wine and boiled it down into sugar. They twisted the husk fiber, the core, into rope strong enough to lash together the very canoes that carried them across the ocean, and into nets to pull food from the sea. They used the shells as cups and bowls and as coals to cook over. They thatched their roofs and wove their walls from the leaves. They built the frames of their houses and their boats from the trunk. One plant gave them food, water, fuel, light, rope, shelter, and the means to keep sailing. In India, they had a name for it that says everything. Kalpavriksha.
The tree that fulfills all wishes. The tree of life. They did not have a word for isotonic hydration. They did not have a word for the antimicrobial fatty acids in the oil or the tensile strength of the fiber. They did not need the words. They had been doing all of it correctly for thousands of years before the first laboratory existed to explain why it worked. And here is what I want you to sit with. Every coconut palm swaying on a postcard beach today, across a third of the tropical world, is standing there because at some point, a human being in a canoe decided to carry it there. That green line of palms is not nature. It is a map. It is the fingerprint of the greatest voyages in human history, planted into the land itself. That is their story. It belongs to the Pacific Navigators and their descendants, and no one should ever be allowed to take it from them. And in the last few years, science has proven it in a way that should give you chills.
because researchers went and read the DNA of coconuts from all around the world, and they found two distinct genetic populations, one from the Pacific and one from the Indian Ocean. And then they found something no historian had written down anywhere. They found coconuts on the coasts of the Americas and Africa whose genetics were tangled together, mixed, in patterns that could only have happened if ancient people had physically carried them along trade routes that we didn't even know existed. The coconut had recorded the voyages. A nut had kept the log that humans forgot to keep. We are, right now, reconstructing prehistoric human globalization by reading the family tree of a piece of fruit. There is no other object on Earth that does that. So the coconut sailed the ancient world, fed the ancient world, and quietly mapped it. And then the modern world arrived, with its ledgers and its ships, and it looked at all of this wisdom and abundance, and it saw only one thing: money. Because it turned out that the oil pressed from dried coconut meat, a substance called copra, was one of the most valuable industrial commodities of the 19th century. This is before anyone had oil wells and pipelines. Copra oil lit lamps. It made soap, mountains of soap, for a Europe that had suddenly decided to be clean. It made candles and lubricants, and eventually margarine to feed factory workers who couldn't afford butter. Suddenly, every palm-fringed island that the Pacific Navigators had lovingly planted was not a paradise. It was a plantation waiting to happen. And plantations, as this channel keeps having to remind you, need one thing above all else. They need bodies to work them, cheap bodies, bodies that cannot say no. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not, because the copra trade helped fuel one of the ugliest and least remembered crimes of the entire colonial era. And it has a name that sounds almost gentle until you know what it means: blackbirding. Here is what blackbirding was. Ships would sail into the islands of the Western Pacific, the New Hebrides, the Solomons, and their crews would take islanders and carry them off to labor on plantations far from home, on the copra estates and the cane fields, for years, for wages that were often a joke, under conditions that killed them in droves. Some were tricked with promises of trade and wonders. Some were lured aboard to look at goods and then simply never allowed to leave. And some were taken at the point of a gun, in raids that left villages burning behind them. I want you to stop picturing this as a statistic and picture one person, because that is the only way any of this becomes real. Picture a young man on a beach in the New Hebrides. He is maybe 17. A ship has come, and the men aboard are smiling and holding up steel axe heads and lengths of bright cloth, and they are calling in closer, pointing below deck, "Come and see! Come and trade." So he wades out and climbs aboard, the way any curious young man on any coast in history would have. And the moment he is below, the hatch closes over his head. He will not see that beach again for years, if he ever sees it at all. He will spend the strongest years of his life bent double under a tropical sun, cutting the meat out of coconuts for a company whose name he cannot read, so that somewhere in London a family he will never meet can wash their hands with sweet-smelling soap. Tens of thousands of Pacific Islanders were taken this way over the decades. Tens of thousands. And a staggering number of them never made it home. This is the part that should make you angry, and I am not going to soften it for you. The tree of life, the plant that had given the ancestors of these very islanders everything they needed to be free, to sail, to feed themselves, to want for nothing, had been turned into the instrument of their captivity. The same fruit, the exact same fruit. In 1 century, a symbol of the greatest freedom humans had ever known on the water, and in the next, the reason the chains came. And it got darker still, because there were men who did the taking, and some of them wrote things down. There was a notorious blackbirder, a recruiter who worked the islands, who advertised his services openly, as if he were selling farm equipment. He offered, in writing, to deliver islander laborers for a set price per head, guaranteed. Per head. He put it on paper the way you would advertise cattle, and he was not hiding, and he was not ashamed. Because in that world, it was a business like any other. And there was worse than him. There was a ship where a doctor and a crew, faced with a hold full of islanders they had lured aboard who then tried to break free in the dark, opened fire down into that packed hold through the night and killed a great many of them, then threw the bodies into the sea before the sun came up. I will be careful here, because the surviving accounts of that night are contested and some of the numbers can't be pinned down. But the killing happened. It reached a courtroom. And what hangs over all of it is a single, cold truth that separates the accident from the crime. Disease and distance and the sea killed some of these people. But the taking of them was a choice.
Men made it, on purpose, for profit, and they wrote the prices down in their own ledgers, not in secret, but in the ordinary bookkeeping of a respectable trade. Sit with that for a moment. Somewhere in a dusty archive, there is a business record that puts a price on a human being, next to the price of copra, in the same neat column, in the same steady hand. And then there is the strangest empire the coconut ever built, and this one I almost can't believe is real. Out in the Indian Ocean, on a scatter of tiny atolls called the Cocos Islands, a Scottish sea captain named John Clunies Ross showed up in the 1800s and simply decided the islands were his. He brought in workers, he planted the whole place with coconut palms, and he founded a private, hereditary kingdom built on a single crop. His family ruled those islands like feudal lords for around 150 years. And here's the detail that tips it into the surreal. They paid their workers not in real money, but in their own private currency, the Cocos rupee, tokens that were worthless anywhere else on Earth and could only be spent at the company store, on goods sold by the same family that owned everything. Think about the perfection of that trap. You work the coconut, you get paid in coconut money. You spend the coconut money back to the man who owns the coconuts, and you can never, ever save enough real currency to buy your way out. A dynasty of self-appointed kings ruled a nation of people with tokens redeemable only for the very thing they were forced to grow. It lasted until the 1970s, when it finally ended and the islands became part of Australia.
There were living human beings who spent their entire lives inside a coconut kingdom, paid in coconut coins, and this was happening in the age of the moon landing. So the coconut had been a spaceship for seeds, a monster in the language, a fruit of Eden in a general's mind, a tree of life for the greatest sailors who ever lived, and a chain around the necks of their descendants. You would think there was nothing left for it to become. You would be wrong. Because the coconut had one more transformation left in it, and it walked straight onto the battlefield. Here is a fact you can carry out of this video and hand to anyone. When soldiers in the First World War pulled on their gas masks to survive a chlorine attack, the thing filtering the poison out of the air they breathed, the thing standing between them and a horrible death, was very often charcoal made from burned coconut shells.
It turns out that when you burn a coconut shell in exactly the right way, you get one of the finest activated carbons in existence, riddled with microscopic pores that trap poison gas molecules out of the air. The demand became so great during the war that governments begged the public to save their coconut shells and their fruit pits and turn them in, by the ton, so they could be burned into the filters that would keep men alive at the front. And that same coconut carbon is still working for you right now. It is in the water filter in your kitchen. It is in the air purifiers scrubbing the air in hospitals. A burned coconut shell is quietly cleaning the water you drink today, using the exact same trick it used to save soldiers from being gassed a century ago. And it did more than filter the war. It helped fuel it. Because the oil pressed from coconuts is rich in glycerin, and glycerin is what you need to make nitroglycerin, and nitroglycerin is what you need to make dynamite and high explosives. The gentle tropical oil that islanders once burned in little lamps and rubbed into their children's skin was, in wartime, refined into the stuff that blows apart steel and stone. The same tree that ran clear water into a dying man's vein on one island was, on another, feeding the machinery of destruction. That is the coconut in a single breath. Life in one hand, death in the other. And the two are pressed from the same fruit. Now, let me hit you with the scale of this thing today, because it is difficult to hold in your head. The world grows more than 60 billion coconuts every single year.
60 billion. Indonesia, the Philippines, and India lead a global trade worth billions. And the coconut is now woven so deeply into modern life that you consume it constantly without knowing. It is in your soap and your shampoo, hidden behind chemical names on the label. It is in the creamy filling of chocolates. It is the fat in a huge amount of processed and packaged food. And that little carton of coconut water you buy at the gym, marketed to you as nature's pure sports drink, you are drinking the same fluid that dripped into a wounded soldier's arm on a Pacific beach. And the marketing is not entirely wrong. It really is close to what runs in your veins. But I promised you the modern world still hides something ugly inside this fruit. And it does, and it is happening right now. In parts of Southeast Asia, some coconut harvests are still gathered by monkeys. Pig-tailed macaques, taken young, chained, and trained to scramble up the towering palms and twist off hundreds of coconuts a day, far more than a human picker ever could. When investigators exposed it in recent years, they documented animals kept on short chains, worked relentlessly, treated as living machines. Major supermarkets in the West pulled certain coconut milk products off their shelves overnight. So, the next time you reach for a can of coconut milk, understand that there is a real chance a chained monkey climbed a tree it never chose to climb to bring it to you. The tree of life is still, in some quiet corner of the world, being harvested by a prisoner. The details have changed across 2,000 years. The pattern has not moved an inch. So let me bring you back to that beach. Back to the man on the stretcher, the one who was supposed to die in 20 minutes, with the ash-colored lips and the empty plasma crates and the ocean between him and any real help. The medic threads the tube into the coconut, and the clear water begins to move down the line and into his arm. And think about everything that is actually flowing into him in that moment. He is being kept alive by a seed that taught itself to cross oceans before humans existed. By a plant that Pacific navigators carried in their canoes across the largest ocean on the planet and turned into an entire way of life. By a fruit that Europe named after a childhood monster and that kings locked in gold, that a general mistook for the fruit of Eden, that men were stolen and killed to harvest, that a Scottish family built a 150-year kingdom upon, that filtered poison gas in the trenches and gave up its oil for dynamite. All of that history, all of those empires and voyages and crimes and wonders, dripping quietly down a rubber tube into one anonymous man's vein on an island no one back home could find on a map. He never knew. He just knew he was alive when the sun came up. You have been drinking this, cooking with this, washing with this your entire life. You have carried a childhood monster's name in your mouth without knowing it. You have poured a piece of prehistoric ocean voyaging into a smoothie. You have used soap made possible by people who were stolen from their beaches and never came home. It was never just a nut. It was a life raft, a lamp, a rope, a weapon, a medicine, a currency, a crime, and a map of the human race, all sealed inside a shell with a little grinning face. You will never look at a coconut the same way again. Now I want to hear from you, and I want you to pick one. Drop a comment and tell me which of these got you the most. Was it the coconut shell charcoal in the gas masks, quietly saving soldiers from poison gas, and now sitting in your kitchen water filter? Was it the coconut kingdom of the Clooney's-Ross family, paying its workers in fake coconut coins they could only spend right back at the company store, all the way into the 1970s? Or was it the chained monkeys, still climbing the palms today to fill the can of coconut milk on your shelf? Tell me which one you're going to repeat to someone this week. And if this changed the way you see the ordinary thing in your kitchen, stay with us, because the next everyday object hiding an empire is already waiting.